She just shows up sometimes, doesn't get how things work these days. That's what my daughter told her colleagues as I stood there, holding a photo of her dead mother. They laughed. One even snickered. The card slipped from my hand, landing face down on marble like my last shred of dignity, and when I bent to pick it up, not one of them moved to help, not even the security guard I'd greeted every Friday for years. But what really broke me, she didn't look back. Then her boss, the same man who called me seasoned texture, offered me a consulting job. 60 days. That's all I had before this humiliation became company law. What he didn't know, I spent 50 years reading lies dressed as numbers, and I don't forget where the rot begins. I wasn't just her father, I was their reckoning. My name is Walter Brinkley, and I'm 75 years old. Each morning I tend my roses, sip coffee on the porch, and take the Friday bus downtown to watch my daughter Sarah's silhouette through the glass walls of Morton & Reed Financial. After my wife Margaret passed 20 years ago, I raised Sarah alone, working 2 jobs to fund her university dreams. The steam rising from my coffee reminds me of those early mornings rushing to drop her at school before my shift. These days, her CEO Marcus Reed commands her attention with his fancy speeches and promises, while my careful warnings about the books I use to balance seem quaint to her now. But numbers don't lie. They never have. And I've spent 50 years reading between ledger lines. The quiet truth waits there, patient as winter frost. But let me start from the beginning. That final ordinary Friday started like any other. I caught the 9:15 downtown, watching the city's glass towers rise through the bus window like crystal formations. 20 years of riding that same route, and I still marveled at how Morton & Reed's building caught the morning light. You ever notice how those mirrored buildings seem alive at certain angles, like they're breathing in the sky itself? I straightened my tie in the lobby's polished marble wall, habit from my accounting days, and nodded to Claire at reception. She gave me that same precise smile she always did, professional but cool as the air, conditioning washing over us. Her fingers never stopped typing. "Good morning, Mr. Brinkley. Miss Sarah's in a meeting." "That's fine, I'll wait." I settled into one of those low leather chairs, the kind that make older folks like me sink too deep. From my pocket I pulled out the card I'd brought, just a simple thing really, with a photo of Margaret I'd found while cleaning out the attic. Sarah at age 6, sitting in her mother's lap at the county fair, cotton candy sticky on both their faces. The kind of memory that deserves sharing, don't you think? My phone buzzed. "Wait," was all Sarah's text said. I watched the minutes tick by on the massive wall clock, its chrome hands sweeping away a half hour before the elevator finally chimed. Sarah emerged with 3 younger colleagues from investor relations, all of them laughing about something called a TikTok challenge. Their shoes clicked importantly across the marble. "Sarah!" I stood, maybe too eagerly, holding out the card. "I found this picture of your mother. Thought you might—" "Oh, God!" Sarah's smile vanished like a light switching off. She turned to her colleagues, who had stopped their important clicking to stare. "Sorry about this. He just shows up sometimes, doesn't get how things work these days." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Sarah, I only wanted— He's just some old man who doesn't get modern life," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Don't let him interrupt your day." Heat flooded my face as one of the junior analysts, a boy who couldn't have been more than 25, actually snickered. The card trembled in my fingers, then slipped, catching air before landing face down on the marble. No one moved to help me retrieve it. I looked toward Tommy, the security guard who'd seen me every Friday for years. He quickly found something fascinating to study on his desk. The silence stretched thick as summer tar while I bent, slowly, carefully, dignity is all about the small things, to pick up the card. "I'll just—" My voice came out rough. I cleared my throat and tried again. "I'll head out then." Sarah was already walking away, heels striking marble like judgment gavel taps. The automatic doors parted with their usual hiss as I stepped into the street noise. Car horns, construction, the city's heartbeat I usually found so comforting. My hand shook as I tucked the card back into my pocket. "Composure," I whispered to myself, the way I used to when facing difficult board meetings. "Keep your composure, Walter." The doors whispered shut behind me, but not before I caught movement in the lobby's reflection. Marcus Reed himself was crossing toward the entrance, that movie star smile of his brightening with recognition. In the mirrored glass, I watched his calculated stride, the perfect tailoring of his suit, the way people instinctively moved aside as he approached. Marcus Reed's hand settled on my shoulder like a well-practiced gesture of familiarity. "Walter, what perfect timing. Join me upstairs?" His voice carried that smooth warmth wealthy men seem born with. "Unless you're headed somewhere urgent." What could I say? The card in my pocket felt heavy as lead, but I managed a nod. "Not urgent, no." "Excellent." He guided me through security with a wave of his badge, past Sarah's startled face, and into a private elevator I'd never known existed. "You know, Walter, I've been meaning to reach out. Your background in traditional accounting, it's exactly what we need right now." The elevator purred upward, all chrome and indirect lighting. "Have you ever noticed how the really expensive places never show you the actual light sources? Everything's hidden, indirect, like the truth itself. Traditional accounting." I kept my voice steady, professional. "That's kind way of saying old school, isn't it?" He laughed, teeth gleaming. "Seasoned wisdom, Walter, that's what I call it. Come, let me show you something exciting." The conference room he led me to was all glass and city views packed with young executives tapping on laptops. A massive screen dominated one wall, showing some kind of presentation. Sarah sat near the head of the table, her face a careful mask. "Everyone," Marcus announced, "this is Walter Brinkley. He'll be consulting on our sterling merger." He clicked to a new slide titled Legacy Perspectives. "Walter brings exactly the kind of human texture this deal needs." I caught two junior VPs exchanging glances, lips twitching. One whispered something that made the other cover a laugh with a cough. "Now, Walter," Marcus continued, "we've got strategy sessions every Tuesday and Thursday. Your role is simple. Share your experience. Add that seasoned perspective." He winked. "Sometimes the old ways really are the best ways, aren't they?" My eyes drifted to the whiteboard where someone had drawn an elaborate timeline. 60 days, marked out in precise increments. Due diligence, compliance reviews, shareholder votes, closing ceremonies, press conferences, public announcements. Each milestone a chance to parade me around, I realized. Each meeting, another opportunity for polite laughter at the old man who didn't get modern life. But Sarah was watching me now, something uncertain in her expression. Maybe if I did this right, showed them all I wasn't just some relic. "These young folks move so fast these days," Marcus was saying to appreciative chuckles. "Remember carbon paper, Walter? Had to press hard enough to leave a mark, but not so hard you tore through. That's the kind of attention to detail we're missing." More titters around the table. Sarah looked down at her phone. "I'd be happy to help," I heard myself say. The words tasted like ash, but I forced a smile. "When do we start?" "That's the spirit." Marcus clapped his hands. "Jennifer, get Walter set up with a badge and the meeting schedule. And Walter," that movie star smile again, "don't worry about dressing up too much. We like our consultants comfortable." I rode the elevator down alone, watching the floor numbers tick past like a countdown. 58 days left until the merger closed. 58 days before this morning's humiliation became permanently woven into company legend. Sarah's doddering old dad, brought in as a mascot for the good old days. My knuckles shook as I pressed the lobby button. Next time I decided I'd wear my best suit, the charcoal one I'd saved for board meetings back when I had my own office. I'd take better notes than any of them. No mistakes, no fumbled cards or awkward pauses. Sarah was gone when I crossed the lobby, but I saw my reflection in the marble walls, slightly stooped, silver hair catching the light. Behind me, Tommy, the security guard, finally met my eyes, something like sympathy in his face. "See you Tuesday, Mr. Brinkley," he said softly. I nodded, straightening my shoulders as those automatic doors hissed open. The city noise washed over me again, but this time it sounded different. Less like a heartbeat, more like a ticking clock. The next Tuesday rolled around like a punch to the gut. I'd spent hours preparing, reviewing old manuals, making neat columns of suggestions that could actually help their bottom line. You know, the kind of solid, practical advice that comes from decades of watching cash flow? The stuff that keeps companies alive while the MBAs play with their PowerPoints? The conference room was packed when I arrived. All designer suits and coffee cups from places I couldn't pronounce. Marcus stood at the front, that 1,000-watt smile on full display. "Walter, right on time." He gestured to an empty chair near the back. "We were just discussing vendor payment optimization." I cleared my throat, flipping open my notebook. Actually, I noticed something in the preliminary reports about payment lag times. Ah, yes, speaking of lag times, Marcus cut in. Walter here probably remembers when you had to wait for checks to physically clear. Remember those days, Walter? When you couldn't just Venmo someone? Chuckles rippled through the room. I pressed on, determined. The current system leaves a 3-day float that's costing... Float! Marcus snapped his fingers. That reminds me of a great story. Walter, tell them about carbon paper and adding machines. You know, before calculators were invented. More laughter, less subtle now. I watched the directors' faces, saw how they'd already categorized me. Comic relief, a walking museum piece. My careful notes suddenly felt heavy in, my hands each page weighted with wasted effort. Sarah sat near Marcus, scrolling through her phone. She hadn't looked at me once. I made it through that meeting somehow, mouth dry, spine straight, but something inside me was crumbling piece by piece. Ever had that feeling where your dignity just leaks away, like water through cupped hands? The next morning, I tried one more time. Stopped at that fancy coffee shop Sarah likes, bought 2 blueberry muffins and her favorite latte. The kind of peace offering we used to share on Saturday mornings when she was little, back when a warm pastry could fix any problem between us. I caught her in the lobby by the elevator banks. Sarah, honey, what are you doing here? Her voice was low, tight. She glanced around like I was carrying something dangerous instead of breakfast. I thought we could talk. 5 minutes, that's all I... Don't. She sliced her hand through the air. Don't embarrass me again, not here. I'm trying to... Don't ruin this for me. Her words hit like slaps. Just don't. The elevator dinged. She stepped in without looking back, leaving me holding a cooling coffee and 2 muffins that suddenly seemed ridiculous. The doors closed, showing me my reflection, shoulders curved inward, like I was trying to make myself smaller. I stood there too long, until Tommy, the security guard, quietly offered to throw the untouched food away. Outside, the evening had turned damp. You know those summer nights when the heat breaks into rain and everything gets this slick neon sheen? I watched taxi lights smear across wet pavement, thinking about how easy it would be to just stop. Stop coming to these meetings. Stop trying to prove myself. Stop fighting for respect that clearly wasn't on offer anymore. The bus ride home felt longer than usual. I gripped the pole, swaying with each turn, wondering if disappearing might be a kindness. To Sarah, to myself. Let her have her glossy corporate life without her embarrassing father mucking things up. Let her forget about the man who'd taught her to balance her first checkbook, who'd worked overtime to cover her student loans. In my apartment, I hung up my jacket, the good one I'd pressed so carefully that morning, stared at my reflection in the bedroom mirror. Maybe, I whispered to the empty room, just maybe, it was time to admit defeat. The word hung there in the darkness, heavy as a gravestone. Maybe. You know those mornings when you wake up and everything's already wrong? The sun wasn't even up, but there I was, running an iron over my blue Oxford shirt for the 3rd time. Wrinkles that weren't even there kept catching my eye. Funny how the mind plays tricks when you're trying to prove something. Don't embarrass me again, Sarah's voice echoed in my head as I poured yesterday's coffee into my favorite mug, the one she'd given me years ago with World's Best Dad worn half off from too many washings. The bitter taste matched my mood just fine. I couldn't face another protein bar breakfast alone in my kitchen, watching the early light creep across linoleum that needed mopping. Instead, I grabbed my coat and headed to Annie's Diner 3 blocks over. The place had been there since before Sarah was born. Same cracked vinyl booths, same coffee-stained menus, same smell of bacon grease and maple syrup that could almost make you forget your troubles. Have you ever noticed how a busy diner can sometimes feel less lonely than an empty apartment? I slid into my usual spot by the window, ordering eggs over easy and wheat toast from Rita, who'd been serving there longer than I could remember. That's when I caught someone watching me from the counter, an older gentleman, silver-haired like me but with better posture. The kind that comes from years of desk work. Forgive me, he said, moving to the empty seat across from me with his coffee cup. But I couldn't help noticing you seemed troubled. The way you keep smoothing that napkin, accountant's habit, isn't it? Always straightening. Papers? My hand stilled. He wasn't wrong. Harold Matthews, he said, extending his hand, retired senior accountant from Riverside Capital, though these days I mostly solve crosswords and critique my wife's garden designs. The name Riverside Capital made my coffee go cold in my throat. That's Marcus Chen's firm. Before the merger that made him CEO, yes. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. You know Marcus. I told him everything. The lobby, humiliation, Sarah's cutting words, the consulting charade, and that 60-day merger countdown ticking away like a time bomb under my dignity. Harold listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of recognition. When I finished, he leaned forward. Let me guess. Marcus has been making little jokes about your old-school methods? Playing you for laughs in meetings? How did you— It's his pattern. Charm on the surface, rot underneath. Harold stirred his coffee methodically. What most people don't know is that Marcus built his empire on creative accounting, the kind that looks perfect in PowerPoint but falls apart under real scrutiny, the kind that needs constant distraction, like, say, an elderly gentleman to use as comic relief, to keep people from looking too closely at the numbers. Something clicked in my mind. The way Harold spoke about ledgers and reconciliations. It was like hearing my own language after weeks of MBA buzzwords. Are you suggesting— I'm suggesting we take a careful look. Public filings, vendor statements, fee allocations. The truth leaves traces if you know where to look. He pulled out a business card, flipped it over, and wrote something. My home office 7 tonight. Bring your laptop and that accountant's eye for detail you've clearly got. I'll supply the coffee and yellow legal pads. I folded the diner receipt carefully, tucking it into my breast pocket like a contract. Outside, morning traffic was building, horns honking as delivery trucks double-parked. But for the first time in weeks, my path felt clear. Back at my apartment, I opened my laptop and created a new spreadsheet. Named it Merger Truth. The blank cells waited like empty containers, ready to be filled with whatever we might find. 2 nights after our first meeting, Harold and I claimed the back booth at Annie's diner. Rita had given us the nod to stay past closing. She'd known me long enough to trust I wouldn't steal the silverware. The dinner crowd had thinned to empty plates and coffee rings on laminate, leaving just the hum of fluorescent lights and the click of our laptops. You know that feeling when you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle and suddenly 2 pieces snap perfectly into place. That's how it felt watching Harold work. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades translating numbers into stories. Look here, he said, turning his screen toward me. These vendor payments, they're flowing into what they're calling synergy accruals. He traced the path with his pen. But watch the timing. I leaned in, squinting at the PDF he'd pulled from the company's investor relations portal. The numbers danced across the page in neat columns, but something felt off, like when you're counting change and a penny doesn't quite ring right. The dates, I muttered, pulling up my own spreadsheet. They're booking the expenses before the invoices even exist. Harold nodded, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And here's where it gets interesting. He pointed to a series of vendor ID numbers. See these? They're duplicates. Same vendor, different payment streams. Ever notice how some people can make accounting sound like a detective novel? Harold had that gift. I'd been recording quarterly earnings calls, playing them back while I worked in my garden. The language around contingent consideration had shifted subtly over the past year. First it was anticipated, then accrued, now recognized. Small changes that probably sailed right past the analysts, but to old bookkeepers like us, they might as well have been flashing neon signs. We need to ask about these at tomorrow's prep session, I said, printing out a carefully worded list of questions. The paper was still warm as I slipped it into a manila folder, but things started getting strange after that. Documents we'd accessed one day would vanish from the shared portal the next. Attachments mentioned in email, threads disappeared like smoke. Even basic quarterly statements seemed to be playing hide and seek. Remember how I mentioned watching people? Well, I started keeping track of who suddenly couldn't help us anymore. Jerry from Accounts Payable, who'd been chatty last week, now had meetings whenever I stopped by. Linda in Reconciliation found urgent business on other floors. Even the intern who'd helped me with the copy machine started taking different routes to the break room. I marked each name in my notebook with a small X. The list grew longer every day. The calendar on my desk showed 43 days until the merger closed. Each morning, I'd cross off another number, feeling time squeezed tighter around us like a fist. But maybe that pressure was exactly what we needed. It made me more careful, more deliberate. "We need to be like ghosts," Harold advised over coffee one morning. "Quiet in the rooms, loud on paper. Let the numbers do the shouting." That strategy led us to our biggest find yet, an invoice trail that dead-ended at a permissions-locked page. The file name included Special Purpose Vehicle, which, according to Harold, was corporate speak for "nothing to see here, move along." Why would a straightforward merger need a structure like that? Harold wondered aloud, tapping his pen against his legal pad. I stared at the access denied message glowing on my screen, thinking about Sarah sitting in her office 14 floors above us, probably still believing in the glossy surface of things. The thought made my chest tight. We'd found enough discrepancies to fill 3 legal pads, but that locked page felt like the door to something bigger, something that might explain why a CEO would want a 75-year-old former bookkeeper as his personal corporate jester. Have you ever walked into a room and known, right down in your bones, that something was about to break? That's how I felt stepping into that prep meeting the next morning. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension. I dressed carefully, pressed shirt, my best tie, the cufflinks Sarah had given me for my 70th birthday. Funny how we armor ourselves with small things when we're heading into battle. The conference room was already full when I arrived. Executives lounged in leather chairs, laptops open, coffee cups steaming. The CEO stood at the head of the table, all perfect teeth and controlled enthusiasm. Sarah sat 3 chairs down from him, not meeting my eyes. I took my usual spot near the back, spreading my notes carefully. The paper felt crisp under my fingers, reminding me of all those nights Harold and I had spent connecting dots. "Let's start with vendor integration timelines," the CEO announced, clicking through his presentation. That's when I raised my hand, just like I'd practiced. "About the synergy accruals," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I noticed some interesting patterns in the payment schedules." The CEO's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Ah, Walter, always so thorough, but perhaps we should stick to the agenda. These payments," I pressed on, "they're being booked before the invoices exist. And the vendor IDs—" "Dad," Sarah's voice cut through the air like a knife. I turned to find her staring at me, her face a mask of professional concern. "Maybe we should let the professionals handle this?" There it was, that word, professionals, like a wall going up between us, brick by brick. The CEO smoothly stepped in. "Sarah's right. These technical details are best left to our accounting team. Now about those integration timelines." Just like that, my questions evaporated into the air-conditioned silence. The meeting moved on, but I stayed frozen, watching my daughter smile and nod at everything her boss said. It felt like watching her walk through a door and lock it behind her. Later that evening, I met Harold at our usual diner booth. The sun was setting, painting the windows orange while we hunched over his laptop. "Look at this," he muttered, pointing to a list of company registrations. "These vendor shells were set up weeks before any merger announcements. And see these patterns?" He circled several entries with his pen. The dates lined up like dominoes, each one feeding into the next. "Classic risk shifting," Harold explained. "They're moving potential liabilities through these shells like a shell game. Question is, why?" I spent the next hour sending follow-up emails about those vendor registrations. The responses came back quick and cold. "Access revoked. Information restricted. Query denied." "Try calling Jerry in accounts payable," Harold suggested. He seemed helpful before, but when I dialed Jerry's extension, his voice was different, distant. "Sorry, Walter, don't remember anything about those payments. Must be mistaken." Linda from Reconciliation was even worse. "Never saw those files," she said, though I distinctly remembered her showing them to me last week. "Maybe you should stick to the merger prep agenda." Back home, I stared at my desk calendar. 32 days left. The numbers seemed to mock me, counting down to something that felt more like a sentence than a celebration. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing in the dark. The spreadsheet we'd been building stared back at me. All those numbers, all those patterns, all those dead ends. With careful clicks, I added a new tab and labeled it Proof or Silence. The choice felt stark enough to deserve its own page. I was about to shut down for the night when my email pinged. The timestamp read 12:01 a.m. exactly. A new portal link had appeared leading to a single file, Deferred's Legacy Final V3 PDF. My cursor hovered over the link while my mind raced. Why would someone send this now, in the dead of night? And why send it to me? Have you ever had one of those moments where the world seems to hold its breath, where everything narrows down to just you and one piece of information that's about to change everything? Well, I was about to have one of those moments. My hands were steady as I clicked the link. Funny how calm we can be right before the storm hits. The PDF loaded slowly, probably because of its size. Harold leaned in closer, his reading glasses catching the light from my laptop screen. "Let's see what someone wanted you to find," he murmured. The document looked ordinary enough at first, standard corporate formatting, neat rows of numbers. But buried in the appendices, we found a worksheet that made Harold sit up straighter. It showed liability rollovers with dates that didn't match anything in the main merger documents. "Look at these integration fees," Harold said, pointing to a column of impressive numbers. "They're listed as paid, but—" He pulled up another window, fingers flying over the keyboard as he cross-referenced the cash accounts. "They never hit the books, not a single one." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "How much are we talking about?" Harold ran a quick reconciliation, his expression growing grimmer by the second. When he finished, he just whistled under his breath. The number on his calculator had more zeros than I cared to count. "There's more," I said, noticing a tiny footnote at the bottom of page 394. It referenced something called Draft Series B7. Following that breadcrumb led us into archived documentation, where we found another spreadsheet, this one full of journal entries marked as manual. You know that feeling when you're about to sneeze and everything just stops for a second? That's what happened when I scrolled down and saw it. Right there, black and white, no room for interpretation. Authorized by Sarah Brinkley. The chair seemed to tilt beneath me. The room narrowed to a tunnel, with my daughter's name burning bright at the end of it. My pulse hammered in my ears like someone was using my skull for drum practice. "This can't be right," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it was. My hands shook as I hit print, waited for the page to come out, smoothed it flat on the desk. Her name was still there, stark and damning. Remember when she was 7 and I caught her writing on the walls with crayon? She'd looked me right in the eye and said it wasn't her, even with the blue Crayola still in her hand. This felt like that moment stretched through a funhouse mirror. Same denial, stakes multiplied by about 1,000,000. I reached for my phone, muscle memory wanting to call her, to hear her explain it away. But what would she say this time? That it wasn't her signature? That she didn't know what those numbers meant, that Daddy just didn't understand modern business? The clock on my desk clicked over to show 27 days until the merger closing. 27 days until all of this became permanent, buried under legal documents and press releases. I set the phone back down without dialing. Harold watched me, his face gentle with understanding. "Now we know," he said simply. Those 3 words carried the weight of everything we'd discovered, not just the fraud, but my daughter's willing part in it. The betrayal felt complete now, circled back to where it started in that lobby, with her dismissing me in front of everyone. My coffee had gone cold beside the keyboard. I picked it up anyway, needing something to do with my hands. The bitter taste matched my thoughts perfectly. You ever notice how a house feels different at night when you can't sleep? Everything gets real quiet except for your thoughts. They get loud, real loud. I spent that whole night pacing my front porch, the wooden boards creaking under my feet, like they were trying to talk some sense into me. The moon kept company, throwing shadows across my wife's rose bushes. Mary had planted those 30 years ago, told me they'd outlast us both. She was right about that, like she was right about most things. Inside, her photo sat on the mantel where it always had, her smile warm and knowing, like she could see right through whatever trouble was brewing. But that night, for the first time since she passed, I couldn't meet her eyes. Found myself wondering if she'd turn that photo face down if she knew what our daughter had become. "What would you do, Mary?" I whispered to the night air. "Where did we go?" "Wrong?" The draft email sat open on my laptop, cursor blinking like a judgment. "Dear Mr. Reynolds," it began. "I realize now that I misread everything. Please accept my resignation from the consulting position." My fingers hovered over the keys, ready to surrender. That's when my phone buzzed. Harold's text was short. "Truth doesn't quit." Just 3 words, but they hit me like a splash of cold water. Made me think of all those nights I'd stayed up doing Mary's medical bills, double-checking every charge, fighting for what was right. I'd never quit then. Why start now? I closed the resignation draft and pulled out the evidence instead. Spent the next 2 hours organizing everything into a clean packet, chronological order, tabs for quick reference, highlighting the key numbers that didn't add up. You know what they say about old dogs and new tricks? Well, this old dog still remembered how to build an airtight case. Started laying out my plan in my notebook, the kind with the spiral binding that Mary always said made my handwriting neater. 3 steps, nice and clear. The merger's closing gala was perfect. Shareholders would be there, legal teams too. Even caught wind that some press stringers were getting invites. Talk about a captive audience. I wasn't taking chances with the evidence. Made 2 copies of everything. One on a thumb drive that I tucked into my sock drawer, another in a 3-ring binder that I wrapped in plastic and hid under the kitchen sink. Mary always said important papers should live in at least 3 places. Even God backs up his work, she'd joke. That's why we have the moon and the sun. When dusk rolled around, I pulled out my best suit, the charcoal gray one Mary picked out years ago. Still fit pretty well, though the shoulders hung a bit loose now. Fixed my tie in the mirror, making sure the knot was straight. Checked my pocket square, adjusted my cufflinks, the ones Sarah gave me for my 70th birthday, back when she still remembered to give gifts. The bus ride downtown felt different this time. City lights bloomed against the darkening sky, and I watched office windows wink out one by one as we passed. The hotel where they were holding the gala grew, larger in the window, all lit up like a Christmas tree. Found myself standing at the revolving door, feeling the weight of the binder in my briefcase. Inside, piano music drifted out, something classical that Mary would have known the name of. I took a deep breath, let my fingers run along the binder's spine one last time. You might be wondering if I hesitated there, having second thoughts. But you know what? The time for doubt was over. I adjusted my tie one last time and stepped through those revolving doors. The ballroom glittered like a snow globe someone had just shaken, all that crystal and silver catching the light. Couples mingled near the open bar while waiters balanced trays of those tiny appetizers that never quite fill you up. Made me think of the church socials Mary used to organize, how she'd always make sure there were proper sandwiches. I found a quiet spot near a potted palm and watched the crowd swell. Every few minutes someone would pat the CEO's shoulder or laugh at his jokes. He worked the room like a conductor, making each person feel like the star of their own private show. Sarah stood nearby, nodding and smiling at all the right moments. Funny how she'd perfected that same head tilt he used when pretending to listen. The music shifted to something jazzy, probably meant to get everyone in a celebrating mood. Above the makeshift stage, they'd hung a banner in the company colors, Future together in gold letters that caught the chandelier light. Seemed almost cruel now, knowing what I knew. "Ladies and gentlemen," the CEO's voice carried across the room as he stepped onto the small platform. "If I could have your attention." He lifted a champagne flute, and the crowd turned like flowers following the sun. That was my cue. I'd positioned myself near the center aisle, briefcase ready. My hands were steady as I pulled out the first packet. Funny how calm you get once you've made up your mind. The first shareholder was easy to spot. Harold had pointed him out earlier. James Morton, biggest individual stakeholder outside the board. He frowned as I placed the packet in his hands, but his fingers closed around it automatically. Unprecedented growth potential. The CEO's voice provided perfect cover as I moved to my next target. Patricia Chen, head of the audit committee. She was exactly where Harold said she'd be, near the chocolate fountain. The packet landed softly next to her clutch. Synergies that will transform. Third packet went to Robert Walsh, minority shareholders representative. He was already flipping pages by the time I turned away. My shoes made no sound on the thick carpet as I approached the lectern. The CEO's speech hitched for just a fraction when I placed the final copy there, right next to his water glass. Might as well have dropped a live grenade. It took him exactly 12 seconds to grab the packet. I counted. His eyes skipped across the first page, and I watched the color drain from his face like water from a tipped glass. Even his tan couldn't hide it. "Now, everyone, let me provide some context." His voice had lost that smooth, honeyed quality. Funny how quick confidence can curdle. But it was too late. The room had already started to shift. You could feel it in the air, like the pressure change before a storm. A director near the front, Thompson, I think his name was, jabbed his finger at something in the printout. Is this Sarah Brinkley's signature? His voice carried just enough for nearby tables to hear. I kept my voice soft, like I was reading from a bedtime story. File. Path is on page 3. Timestamp shows the entry date. Reconciliation variances are highlighted in yellow. Amazing how much damage plain facts can do when they're lined up properly. The security guards by the door shifted their weight, hands hovering near their radios. Poor fellows looked mighty uncertain about who they were supposed to be protecting from what. Camera flashes started popping like summer lightning. Phones appeared in hands. Throughout the room, their blue glow-making faces looked ghostly. Somewhere in the crowd I heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. A ripple of gasps moved through the room as people reached page 4. Exactly the reaction Harold predicted when he'd said, "That's where the numbers tell the real story." The live band stumbled to a stop mid-song, the final note hanging in the air like an unfinished question. Legal counsel huddled in corners, phones pressed to their ears, whispering urgently about immediate action required and potential liability. I took 3 steps back, letting the wave I'd started build on its own. The room seemed to tilt slightly, like a ship taking on water. Reality was shifting, and everyone could feel it. I moved for an emergency shareholder session. Morton's voice cut through the growing chaos. Right now, in the Sierra room down the hall. And just like that, the carefully orchestrated celebration cracked right down the middle. I stood in the hotel's side corridor, letting the chaos wash over me. The grand ballroom doors kept swinging open and shut, spilling fragments of heated voices into the hallway. Complete audit of all legal implications, trading implications. The words bounced off marble floors like angry echoes. You know that moment when you're standing in the eye of a storm. You started. Everything around you is spinning, but you're perfectly still. That's where I was. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Harold's message was simple. News already hit the wire. Below it was a link to MarketWatch. The headline made my throat tight. Breaking merger halted. CEO faces audit committee probe. Multiple covenant violations alleged. Trading suspended pre-market. The cream-colored wallpaper suddenly felt too close, too warm. I loosened my tire notch, remembering mornings at my old accounting desk when the numbers were honest and a signature meant something real. A sharp sound cut through my thoughts, heels clicking rapidly on marble. Sarah burst through the ballroom doors, mascara leaving dark trails down her cheeks. She clutched a cardboard box against her chest like a shield. I could see her nameplate inside, along with a few framed photos, and that crystal paperweight I'd given her when she made director. "Daddy?" Her voice cracked on that word, the first time she'd called me that in years. "Please, you have to fix this." She stepped closer, her perfume mixing with the scent of panic. "They're saying I have to resign everything I worked for. Please." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, past the designer suit, past the careful makeup now running in streams, past the polished image she'd built. For a moment I saw her at 6 years old begging me to repair her broken bicycle chain. "Truth fixes itself, Sarah." My voice came out gentle but firm, like when I used to explain why she couldn't have candy before dinner. "That's what makes it truth." The elevator dinged behind us. She turned toward it, then back to me, her eyes pleading. "Come with me. Just, down to the lobby." I shook my head slowly. Instead, I walked ahead to the lobby's glass doors and held one open. Outside, camera flashes exploded like lightning bugs in July. Sarah hesitated, clutching her box tighter. "Ms. Brinkley, is it true about the falsified documents? Any comment on the CEO's involvement? Will you cooperate with investigators?" The reporter's questions pelted like rain. I kept my hand on the door, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. Sarah straightened her spine, one thing she'd learned, honestly from me, and walked through. I didn't follow, didn't need to gloat or lecture or add my voice to the chaos. Some lessons teach themselves, if you just step back and let them. The lobby emptied quickly after that, leaving me alone with the potted palms and their long shadows on marble. I pushed through the revolving door into night air that smelled like autumn coming. Harold stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking like he'd been expecting me. "Quite a show in there," he said. "Wasn't meant to be a show," I replied. "Just truth finding its level like water always does." We caught the late bus home together. The sky had turned that soft lavender color it gets just before full dark. when day and night are still negotiating terms. Streetlights blinked on one by one, like stars being hung. I watched office buildings slide past the window, their windows still bright, with other people's stories. In one of those rooms I knew, Sarah was probably packing up years of ambition into boxes. In another, lawyers were already drafting statements. And somewhere, a CEO was watching his carefully constructed world crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. But I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about tomorrow's coffee on my porch, and how the morning glory vines needed trimming, and how sometimes the hardest thing about justice is simply letting it happen. The key clicked in my front door lock, just as midnight slipped into tomorrow. Harold's footsteps creaked behind me on the old porch boards, faithful company right to the end. We'd ridden the whole way home in comfortable quiet, like two fishermen after a long day on the water. I headed straight for my kitchen, that familiar harbor of late-night thoughts. The fluorescent light hummed to life, showing yesterday's coffee mug still waiting in the sink. Funny how some mornings feel like they happened in another lifetime. "Let me put on a fresh pot," I said, reaching for my brass cafetiere. It was my wife Marie's wedding gift to me, still gleaming after all these years. "Least I can do after keeping you out past respectable hours." Harold settled into a kitchen chair, his tie loosened, but his spine still accountant straight. "Walter, you said I don't need to." "I do need to." I laid the evidence binder on the counter beside the cafetiere, its weight finally off my shoulders. "Not just for tonight. For everything since that first morning in the diner when you noticed something was eating at me." The coffee ritual gave my hands something honest to do, measuring beans, working the grinder, heating water to just shy of boiling. You can't rush good coffee, something Sarah never learned in her race to the top. "Wasn't much," Harold said, modest as always. "Just recognized the look of a man who needed somebody to believe him. More than believed. You helped me prove it. I watched the coffee bloom in the press. That's worth proper thanks." While the coffee steeped, I opened my laptop one last time. The audit committee would need a point of contact, someone to walk them through the paper trail. I kept the email brief and professional. Just my phone number and a simple offer to clarify any process questions about the documentation. No accusations, no emotion. The facts would do their own talking now. The soft click of the laptop closing felt like the period at the end of a very long sentence. I poured 2 cups, the steam rising like morning fog over a lake. "To honest books," I said, raising mine slightly. "And honest men who keep them," Harold answered. After Harold left, I stood in my quiet living room looking at Marie's photo on the mantel. I'd turned it face down that night Sarah first cut me with her words in the lobby. Couldn't bear to have Marie see her daughter's shame, or mine. Now I lifted the silver frame, wiped a finger's worth of dust from the glass. Marie's smile hadn't changed, that mix of wisdom and warmth she'd passed on to Sarah. I set the photo upright again. "You'd have known what to say to her," I whispered. "But maybe some lessons need time to root." Speaking of roots, the first hint of dawn was starting to soften the kitchen window. I stepped out into my backyard, dew soaking through my dress socks. My fingers found the soil by the fence, still cool and damp from yesterday's rain. There was a bare patch there where an old maple had come down in last year's storms. I'd been meaning to fill it, but something always felt wrong about rushing to plug the gap. Now I knew exactly what belonged there. Ever since Sarah was little, I'd told her stories about oak trees, how they grow slow but sure, how their roots go deeper than their branches reach high, how they stand through whatever storms come. She used to love those stories. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten them. I found my spade in the garden shed, ran the whetstone along its edge until it whispered sharp. The first cut into the soil was like signing my name, deliberate, permanent. I worked in a careful circle, just wide enough for what was coming. The young oak sapling waited in its bucket by the shed, wrapped in burlap and twine. I'd bought it weeks ago, not knowing exactly why. Sometimes the heart chooses before the head catches up. Dawn was starting to paint the fence boards gold. If I worked steady, I could have this little oak settled in its new home before the sun climbed high enough to warm the wood. That felt right. Good work done early, the way I'd always lived. My phone buzzed as I knelt by the marked circle. The morning's financial headlines were rolling in, each one striking like a hammer. CEO ousted amid fraud claims. Emergency debt calls triggered. class action suits filed by major shareholders. The trading halt would lift soon, but everyone knew where the stock was headed. You can't polish rot once it's exposed to sunlight. Remember those old westerns where the whole town would gather to watch justice done? This was the modern version, played out in boardrooms and Bloomberg terminals instead of dusty streets. But the ending felt just as final. I scrolled through my notifications, more out of duty than desire. Sarah's resignation statement had just posted on the company website. Short, corporate crisp, naming personal accountability without begging forgiveness. No mention of me, which was fine. Some bridges stay burned. "You ready for this?" Harold called over the fence, startling me. He'd changed into gardening clothes, practical as always. Been ready since dawn. I lifted the oak sapling from its bucket, burlap still wrapped around the root ball. The young tree wasn't much to look at yet, barely as tall as my chest. But that wasn't the point. Good things take time. You know what they say about revenge being best served cold? They're wrong. The best revenge is served quiet, letting truth do the heavy lifting while you tend to what matters, like making sure this little oak had the right start. I positioned the sapling in the center of my marked circle, checking the angle from different sides. Had to be just so. These early decisions would shape its whole future. Harold watched without comment, respecting the process. The soil came away in steady shovelfuls, dark and rich with promise. I'd amended this patch over the years, working in compost until the earth felt alive in your hands. Each scoop went onto my top, neat and contained. No mess, no waste, no rushing. "Depth looks good," Harold offered as I stepped back to check my work. The hole was wide enough for the roots to spread, deep enough to anchor against whatever winds might come. I unwrapped the burlap carefully, exposing the root ball. Young roots pale and reaching, ready for better soil than their nursery pot. Funny how something so small could hold so much potential. The sapling settled into its new home like it had been waiting for exactly this spot. I backfilled slowly, pressing the soil with careful hands to eliminate air pockets. You can't rush this part. Roots need to feel the earth, supporting them from all sides. "Water?" Harold passed over his gallon jug. I poured in a slow circle, watching the dark earth gleam as it drank deep. The water would help the soil settle, help the roots find their way down. Nature knows what to do if you give it honest materials and time. The stake went in next, angled just so. 3 loops of twine, firm but not tight, enough to guide but not restrict. The oak would need to learn to stand on its own, but there was no shame in a little early support. Harold gave me a quiet nod as he gathered his tools. No words needed. We'd seen truth through together, from that first conversation in the diner to last night's revelations. Some partnerships work best in silence. I stood back to study the work. The young oak looked right there against the morning sky, its leaves already turning to catch the light. Below ground, those roots would grow deeper than any scandal, stronger than betrayal. Here's something I've learned in 75 years. True respect isn't about winning or losing. It's about planting something that outlasts the storm, something that grows stronger in the testing. I brushed the soil from my hands and spoke to the quiet air. Respect earned never dies. The oak's leaves whispered back, catching the first real sunlight of the day.